This present recording comes from G.T.W. Patrick's excellent introduction to and translation of the Extant Fragments of Heraclitus. What has given rise to the reviving interest in Heraclitus attested by the monographs which have lately appeared? The modern world hardly hopes to get any new light from his oracular sayings, gathered in mutilated fragments from Philo and Plutarch, from Clement and Origen. Such unhoped for light, however, as our introductory study has shown, may for some minds be found breaking in after all. But the interest in the philosopher of Ephesus is historical. The new discovery of the present half-century is that the way to study philosophy is to study its history, and especially its genesis. The passion for origins has carried the interest back to Greek philosophy, and finally back to the beginnings of Greek philosophy. But there is still another reason for going back. In the confusion arising from the fall of the idealistic philosophy in Germany, it was first thought that it would be necessary to return to Kant and secure a new footing. Not that any new light was seen emanating from Kant, but error having arisen, it was necessary to trace it to its source. This movement neither has been successful, nor does it promise to be. In fact, there is a certain wariness in philosophy of the whole modern subjective method. The result has been that thinkers have turned away from it to the one objective side of modern philosophy, namely the sciences. Those, however, who still retain their love of philosophy in its larger sense are going back farther than Kant. They see that the whole Hume-Kantian-Fichtean movement was a digression, a sort of branch road, which, to be sure, had to be explored before philosophy could go on in safety, but which was found to lead nowhere in particular, and that, having thanked these investigators for their services rendered, we may decline to concern ourselves further with this digression, but go on with our search for objective results. In this search, our starting point must be from that philosophy which is most free from this whole subjective tendency. Such is the philosophy of Greece. Considering, therefore, that the introspective method has not proved so fruitful as was hoped, and that it is at least more modest, if not more rational, to regard man as a part of nature rather than nature as a part of man, students of philosophy are turning their attention to the Greek philosophers, where the freer and more ingenious conception rules. These two causes, therefore, the former, the passion for studying the origin and development of thought and the connection of different systems of thought, the latter, the need of disinfecting our minds from all the germs of pathological introspective habit, and putting ourselves as an experiment in the position of those who took it for granted that nature was larger than man, have led us back to Greek philosophy and especially to its sources. In either of these aspects, Heraclitus is important. He is a perfect, by all means the most perfect, illustration of those qualities which are usually supposed to characterize the Greek mind, namely, receptivity, unprejudiced freedom of thought, love of order, and trustful confidence in the unity of man and nature. Of all the Greek schools, these qualities were best represented by the Ionian thinkers who, coming before what has been called the fall of man in Socrates, were free from the later dialectical disturbances, and of the Ionians, Heraclitus, the last, best incorporates them. But it is in the other aspect that the philosopher of Ephesus is most important, namely, in the origin and history of ideas. Let us notice summarily what has come from him. To Heraclitus we trace the philosophy of change, prominent in subsequent Greek philosophy, as the indirect cause of the counter-movement of Socrates and Plato with its powerful determining influences, central in modern times as motion in the philosophy of Hobbes and the ground principle in the important system of Trendelenburg, and finally in a logical transformation prominent in both German and English thought as Werden or becoming. To Heraclitus we trace the notion of relativity, the central point in the doctrine of the sophists, which by withdrawing every absolute standard of truth threatened to destroy all knowledge and all faith, and which sent Socrates searching for something permanent and fixed in the concepts of the human mind, and so led to the finished results of Plato and Aristotle. To Heraclitus we trace some of the fundamental doctrines of the Stoics, namely, their abrogation of the antithesis of mind and matter and their return to pre-Socratic monism, their conception of nature as larger than man and his complete subjection to it, and finally, their doctrine of the future conflagration of the world, later an influential factor in Christianity. These were the thoughts which were most important in their determining influence upon subsequent philosophy. The following, while in themselves no less important, were less directly involved in the history of opinion. Of these, the first is the notion of law and order, absolute and immanent in the world, an idea so large that no Greek follower could grasp it, and yet vital to Heraclitus' system, for without it, his philosophy becomes the philosophy of desperation, the source among the ingenious Greeks of the nihilism of Gorgias, or the universal doubt of the skeptics, and among the brooding moderns the source of the pessimism of Schopenhauer. To Heraclitus, again, we trace, as Teichmuller has shown, the closely related doctrine of the immanence of God in the world, so that we have in him one source of the pantheistic system. To Heraclitus, finally, we trace the physical law of opposites, the thought that all order and harmony and apparent permanence are the result of opposite tension, the balance of centrifugal and centripetal forces. Less involved in the history of philosophy, though most important to Heraclitus, and in themselves most interesting to us of modern times, are his great ethical thoughts, which we have already outlined. The determinative ideas of the Ephesian may be summed up in a word by saying that they represent all that way of thinking against which Socrates and Plato raised the whole weight of their authority. Without repeating here the facts, well enough known to everybody, of the Socratic reaction in Greek philosophy, we must sketch one or two phases of it in order to establish the influence and explain the final defeat of the Heraclitic philosophy. In Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, philosophy underwent a change more radical than any other in its history, a change that was ultimately to revolutionize all thought, and through its influence on Christian theology, to enter as a large determining element to all Western civilization. Heraclitus is the representative of what philosophy was before that change. Socrates said he could not understand the book of Heraclitus. That was not strange. The Ephesian could have told him the reason why. The man who could learn nothing from the fields and trees, see Plato's Phaedrus, page 230, who spent all his time in the agora conversing with other men about virtue, and who never seemed to realize that there was a world above the heads and under the feet of men, was not likely to understand the book of Heraclitus. Could the Ephesian philosopher have taken the Athenian logician out and given him a few lessons from nature at first hand? Could he have induced him to desist for a while from his boring into human intellects in search of a definition, and got his gaze lifted up to the clouds and stars, and put him in actual contact with the perielon, which translates to environment, he would have been an apter scholar with the book. But it is quite impossible, even in fancy, to think of these two men together. The communer with nature, the stern misanthropic sage and prophet of Ephesus, had no points in common with the society-loving Athenian sophist. They were radically different. And on this difference hangs the secret of the development of philosophy for 2,000 years. Socrates was not a Greek at all. He denied the most characteristic traits of his nation. He was a modern in many true senses. He was a curiosity at Athens, and consequently very much in vogue. Socrates represents the birth of self-consciousness. In practicing his Maieutic art to this end, he little thought that he was giving the death blow to the most beautiful trait of his countrymen, namely the instinctive, the unconscious, the naive. No doubt this new birth had to take place some time, but under Socrates' direction it was premature. The old methods were not yet dead. Here historians of philosophy err. They say the pre-Socratic philosophers of nature had in vain tried to solve the problems of the world, and it was high time for a critical philosophy that should begin with man. In vain, indeed. Had the naturalists laboured in vain when the foundations of the atomic philosophy had been laid in Abdera, that of mathematics in Italy, and of far-seeing metaphysics and ethics in Ephesus? Socrates and Plato took fright too easily at the sophists. Their philosophy would have died with them. Not so that of Democritus, Pythagoras, and Heraclitus. Socrates was a professor of clear thinking. Clear thinking is in itself well, but 2 solid centuries of clear thinking from Descartes to Hegel have in modern times ended in failure. We long to know what natural thinking would have accomplished if it had been left an open field a while longer in Greece. Then again, clear thinking was overdone. It was, to be sure, not Socrates' fault that his method was afterwards abused, but as a matter of fact, it took in later history a pathological turn that has resulted in widespread evils. Over self-consciousness, too much inwardness, and painful self-inspection, absence of trust in our instincts and of the healthful study of nature, which in ethics are illustrated in modern questions of casuistry, and in philosophy in Cartesian doubt and in the skepticism of Hume, characterize our worst faults. The philosophy and ethics of Heraclitus, as we have seen, stood in vital opposition to all these traits. But there was another respect in which the fall of man took place in Socrates. The love of beauty and form, and particularly beauty of the human body, characterized all the Greeks until Socrates, but characterizes modern people in a relatively small degree. Socrates cared nothing for outward beauty, but to the surprise of his fellow citizens laid all the emphasis upon moral beauty. We will say he was too large-hearted to have had a personal motive for so doing. It may be that the Greeks estimated physical beauty relatively too high, but the rebound has been too great. Caught up by the genius of Plato and intensified by the tenor of his philosophy, and met 6 centuries later in Alexandria by a powerful current of the same tendency from Judea, it effected the complete destruction of the Greek idea, and with it, of course, of Greek art. In the medieval church, inherited moral deformity was a sin of such extreme import that for it a man was to be forever damned, but inherited physical deformity was not only not a sin, but often a blessing, teaching him as it did the relative worthlessness of the earthly life and body. So far was the Greek idea reversed that the body, instead of being the type of beauty, became the type of impurity, and from being the support of the soul, became its contaminator. The flesh, indeed, was a symbol of evil. The results in a modern life are only too well known. Among them may be mentioned the loss of appreciation of the worth of the present physical life in itself, failure to recognize the close connection of soul and body, and that the health of the former depends on the health of the latter, resulting in all the strange devices to secure the welfare of the soul in the face of persistent disregard of the laws of physical health, or in such attempts as that of sustaining the moral status of a community where all hygienic laws are violated. This idea has been ground into the popular mind by so long education that modern educators find it a serious problem how to correct it. It is not merely physical education that is wanted, but a reconstruction of our notion about the relation of body and mind. The Socratic work must be, in part, undone, and we must get back more nearly to the pre-Socratic conception of balance. For to them, physical ugliness was no less an evil than moral ugliness. But there is still another aspect of the Socratic apostasy, as important as those we have mentioned, and so far-reaching in its effects that it determines modern thought even to the lowest ranks of society. In this movement begun by Socrates, but perfected by Plato and Aristotle, the central thought of the Heraclitic philosophy was denied, and denied with such power that now after 2200 years it hardly dares assert itself. We refer, of course, to the Platonic transcendentalism. It was designed to give the death blow to Heraclitus, and it succeeded ultimately beyond the wildest hopes of its founders. Strictly, it was begun by Anaxagoras. We have already seen with Teichmuller how the doctrine of transcendent reason gained its first characteristic, pure separation, in the nous of Anaxagoras, its second, identity, in the definitive work of Socrates, but it was Plato who elevated it into a great system and gave it to the world for a perpetual inheritance. Finally, Aristotle, as if the fates conspired to make this doctrine immortal, took it up and adapted it to unpoetical inductive minds. Heraclitus, in a wonderful conception of the world, had abolished every antithesis and enunciated a system of pure monism. The Socratic school reversed his plan and set up a dualism of universal and particular, noumenon and phenomenon, mind and body, spirit and matter, which has dominated all philosophy, religion, and literature. It is with the origin of this dualism that we are concerned, not with the familiar history of its outcome, but yet we may recall what to the student of philosophy or even of history it is needless to more than mention. How this dualism fastened itself upon subsequent thought, how as realism and nominalism it divided the schoolmen, how as mind and matter it left Descartes in hopeless difficulty, how Spinoza founded a philosophy expressly to resolve it, but succeeded only by the artifice of terms, how Leibniz solved the problem, though with too much violence and by use of the same boldness with which its founders established it, how Kant finally left the antithesis unexplained, how again as the material and immaterial it fixes itself in the psychology of Aristotle, who affirmed as the higher part of the human mind the active nous, or principle of pure immateriality, cognizant of the highest things, identical with the divine prime mover, and immortal, thus constituting for man the highest glorification that he ever received from his own hand. How Thomas Aquinas, spokesman for a powerful church, adopted this psychology and fastened it upon the modern popular world. How finally, in the sphere of religion proper, the transcendentalism of Plato has grown into the belief in pure spirit and spiritual existences, peopling heaven and earth and holding communion with matter and body, though having absolutely nothing in common, if the paradox may be excused, with them. Such has been in part the wonderful expansion of the Platonic idealism. And what was all this for in the first place? It was raised primarily as a barrier against the dissolving power of the eternal flux of the Heraclitians. A philosophy had arisen in Greece that denied all permanence. Misunderstood by the sophists and abused by Cratylus, it called out the protest of Socrates, at heart the sincerest man of his contemporaries. Man, impelled by that very faculty which connects him most closely with nature, namely, the sense of dependence, demands something permanent and unchangeable, upon which he can base his laws, religion, and philosophy. If he cannot find it in nature or in revelation, he will make it out of a part of himself. This is what Socrates and Plato did. Socrates, seeking the permanent for ethical motives, detesting nature and failing to find there anything fixed and abiding, turned to man and man's manner of thinking. By analysis of thought, he separated out general concepts which appeared to be the same for all. Plato, perhaps less in earnest than subsequent ages gave him credit for, hypostasized them, raised them into real objective existences, henceforth to become idols, convenient entities to fill all gaps in human reasoning, objects of the dreams of poets and the worship of all the religious archetypes, from which a lazy philosophy could deduce the universe. How, we naturally ask, could this audacious piece of anthropomorphism, in which man deliberately took his own norms of thought, projected them outwards, and elevated them into gods, impose itself upon the world as it did? There are two answers. First, it flattered men immensely, and like all anthropomorphisms, thereby won half the battle. Second, it did not succeed at once, but slumbered for 4 centuries, and finally, in the decadence of all systems of philosophy and the breaking up of the old civilization, awakened to supply the groundwork of a religious revival. Platonism fell dead on the Greek world. Plato, and Aristotle as well, shot over the heads of their fellows. The philosophy of the Academy was a brilliant piece of speculation such as only the age of Pericles could call out. After that, philosophy fell back into the old ways. The older Academy dragged out a short existence and died. Zeno, a Cypriot, but in his desire for unity more Greek than Plato, studied first with Polemo, head of the Academy, but disappointed with Platonism turned back to Heraclitus. His school, as well as the Epicureans and Skeptics, returned to the Heraclitean monism. These schools loyally upheld for 3 centuries the Greek idea of the unity of man and nature. But philosophy itself was doomed and fated to pass over into religion on the one hand and mysticism on the other. Platonism was admirably adapted to this end. In luxurious Alexandria, the weary inductive method of Aristotle, which the Ptolemaics had instituted in the museum, soon yielded to the fascinating lazy philosophy of Plato. Philo the Jew, Plutarch the moralist, Valentinius the Gnostic, Origen the Christian, all yielded to it in greater or lesser degree. In Plotinus it reached its full fruitage. Porphyry, his pupil, related that he was ashamed of having a body and was careless of its needs. So anxious was he ecstatically to absorb his soul in the suprarational transcendent one. Here we have at last consequence of the Socratic doctrine of mind. Here we have the extreme opposition to the naturalism of Heraclitus, which considered man as a subordinate part of nature. Greek philosophy ended with the triumph of Socrates and the defeat of Heraclitus. The wealth of Plato and Aristotle was the bequest that was handed over to the coming centuries. The Greek naturalists were forgotten. It was reserved for the present century to revive and vindicate them. In what has been said in setting in relief the philosophy of Heraclitus, it is obvious that we have been concerned with but 2 or 3 aspects of that of Socrates and Plato, namely, its transcendental, idealistic, and subjective character. It is not necessary to add that were we referring to the other side of it, as for instance, the undeniable importance of Socrates' contribution to ethics, and that of Plato to ethics and religion as well as to the real scientific thought, the result would be very different. And of the idealism itself, its very fascination and prevalence argue that it meets some want of human beings. It is poetry, to be sure, but as poetry it has been and will still be useful in saving men from the dangers of coarse materialistic thought.